All right, guys, Murph's here. And today we're going to do a little comparison between rifle light setups that I have available. Now, the purpose of this is not to necessarily say one light is better than the other, as much as to show you what your dollar is getting, as well as some different aspects of rifle lights. What are positive outcomes? What are kind of your trade-offs and all that kind of stuff whenever you're talking about lumens and candela, lux, all those types of things. So that is what we're going over today. Now, you guys can't necessarily see it, but you can get an inkling. I am surrounded by different rifles I have with their individual light setups, and I've got a lot. This isn't even all of them necessarily, but this is a really great representation of a lot of different setups. Now, we are primarily looking at defensive rifle setups. However, I do have a pistol light mounted on one of these long guns. We'll talk about that more once we get there. Now, what is the role of a light on a fighting rifle? Because if you guys have seen my fighting rifle setup video, you know that I have a requirement that rifles have a light on them. It's all about target identification. In both a professional and home defense type setting, it is exceedingly important to be able to properly identify your target prior to engagement. Far too many people have died in a case of mistaken identity in a home defense type situation because the person who wound up pulling the trigger did not properly identify the target and wound up killing a family member. That's unacceptable, especially since weapon lights are plentiful out on the market. They are relatively inexpensive, ranging to very expensive, and there's a lot of different things that you get out of that. Now, of course, there's a discussion to be had over having a non-weapon attached light available to be able to identify targets, because you know there's a discussion to be had as far as pointing a weapon at somebody that you don't necessarily know is a target yet. I get that. That's not necessarily the discussion that we're having here today. Now, in a professional sense, a weapons light is even more important for a couple of different reasons. Now, again, target identification, but we're not just necessarily talking about like a binary type aspect of target engagement in the home. Like in my case, I have no children. The only time I have family members here is whenever they're staying over for traveling and stuff like that, friends and all those types of things. So those are very specific circumstances where I know that I have another person in the house that I don't necessarily wish to shoot. In my scenario, should the alarm go off or I hear something go bump in the night, the only other person that I'm worried about, the wife, is next to me. I know where she's at. So target identification at that point becomes very binary. If you're a person that I did not expect to be in the house, you are now a threat. You can see how that kind of plays out there. In a professional type sense, military, law enforcement, whatever it may be, it doesn't necessarily work out that way. You actually have to be able to identify that individual. Is this the person that I am pursuing? Does this person have a weapon or explosives on them, something like that? You've got a lot of detail you're trying to pick up with that light. So the demands between home defense and actual professional use might be a little bit different. Now, of course, these things can cross, but it all comes down to how much money it is that you want to spend, and that's what we have to evaluate. Now, keep in mind, even in daylight scenarios, you might run into a situation where you need a weapons-mounted light. Deep shadows, dark rooms, all those types of things. There are dark spaces in the daylight, and you have to account for those as well. All right, now, in order to be able to talk about advantages and disadvantages of different lights, we do have to go ahead and talk about a couple of measurements that are used in terms of lights, and there are three that we're going to talk about. First off is lumens. Lumens is light output. And keep in mind, guys, these are not necessarily dictionary definitions. These are definitions according to Murph. So this is very much so a layman explaining all of this. So keep that in mind. There might be a more proper scientific definition, but that's not necessarily what we're working with here today. All right, so lumens, that's light output. That is your measurement for how much energy you're getting out of any particular light. And there's a wide variety of ranges that you can get with that. Candela. Candela is kind of like talking about the beam, the distance that light is able to cover. So we got two different aspects that we need to talk about whenever we're talking about what that lumens comes out to. Candela is one of those aspects. Now, something with a very high candela, like a spotting light, is going to have a very tight beam. It's going to be very focused, and whenever it gets up close, it's going to blot out a lot of information. But at greater distances, you have more area that you can cover and you can pick up more detail. Now, the other aspect of this that we talk about is lux. Now, lux is going to be kind of the ambient light around that beam, kind of a byproduct of the beam. And it's kind of a combination of both candela and then also lumens as well. And it's a balance relationship there that I honestly don't necessarily fully understand well enough to be able to get into very deeply. But lux is kind of that ambient light around, right? So items that have really good lux would be like lamps. You don't necessarily need a lot of candela in a lamp. You don't need that particular part of your desk to be super lit up as much as you need a lot of ambient light to be able to cast a wider overall coverage of light so you can see more of what's going on around it. That's what we're looking for with Lux. Now, as we go through these lights today, we're going to talk about different advantages as far as lumens, candela, lux, and then also how that feeds back into price, construction, all those types of things. And at the end, we'll talk a little bit about light setup. All right, now, one last little caveat I want to get into before we roll full on into the description is the majority of these rifles, if not all of them, have at some point been reviewed on the channel. So I will go ahead and post links in the description to these videos if you guys are interested in the setup and you want to know a little bit more about it. Now, I've got a little list going on here of all the stuff that we're going to be discussing here today because it is kind of a lot of information to keep track of, and I thought it would be better if I just went ahead and put it into written form. So, first light I want to start off with is the one mounted on this Ruger Mini14. All right, and this is a Firefield light laser combination. This has a 180 lumen light and a green visible laser. Now we'll talk more about lasers here at the end. Now this light costs about 80 bucks. The beam on this particular light, and I'll roll in pictures that go along with this. Something to keep in mind with these pictures, guys. So these pictures are taken in both outdoor and indoor conditions. The outdoor conditions are to my fence in the backyard, which is about 31 yards away, and the indoor conditions are in my spare bedroom, which is about 18 feet across. So, the beam on the Firefield is rather diffuse. We have a lot of lux and not necessarily a lot of candela, which means that we kind of lose detail in a more open space. We still have projection going out into that open space, but as far as being able to pick out like the spaces in between the slats and the fence and all that kind of stuff, you're not necessarily getting that out of that particular light. In a close range type condition, it's still lighting up the room, and I could see this being acceptable dependent upon your uses. If you're hoping to be able to stretch this into an open area, I would not recommend this light. If you're looking to primarily utilize it in an indoor area and you're kind of strapped for cash, this isn't the worst option out on the market. So, that's the Firefield. Go ahead and get that guy out of the way. Let's go ahead and talk about the Protac HLX, which is on the wife's AR556 made by Ruger. Now, the Protac HLX comes in at about right around $100. And keep in mind, guys, prices change frequently. There's sales, or things get discontinued. The market changes, all that kind of stuff. So these are just broad categories of price. Don't think about these as hard lines. You're going to run out and find them at these costs. It might cost more, it might cost less. Who knows? It's a snapshot in time. But the Protac HLX costs about 100 bucks. It is 1,000 lumens. And we can see here, it has a wider overall coverage for its beam, but it doesn't have the best candela. So the candela, how we judge candela, you have that bright center point of the light. That's more or less the focus of your beam. That's your candela representation there. And we can see that the candela on this particular light is good. It's definitely better than the Firefield, but as we move forward, we'll see better options coming up. But we do get a little bit more detail. Our lux around the light, it gives us a lot of great coverage. It's opening up a lot of area for a little bit greater distance, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. All right, so that's the Protac HLX. Let's go ahead and cover the WML. Now, the WMLs have a tendency to be a little controversial. And a lot of that comes back to construction. Inforce has had some issues in the past where people have complained that these are not terribly durable, that they've broken them, all those types of stuff. A lot of those issues come back to their pistol lights, but some of that has been noted with the WML line. Now, I was buying quite a few of these lights at one point because they are relatively inexpensive, coming in at around 120 bucks. And they're fairly lightweight. That's one of the things I like about them. Now, unfortunately, because they're lightweight, this is a plastic construction, so it's not going to be as durable as some of these other options like the Protac and all that kind of stuff, which are actually made of like aluminum or, you know, Surefire lights. You have steel and aluminum lights out there on the market. They're going to be more durable than a plastic light. That's just common sense there, right? Now, the output on this is about 400 lumens, which isn't bad. With that, we get a wider overall beam, and we don't necessarily have like the greatest candela and all this kind of stuff. We're kind of lacking for a little bit of detail and all that, but this is a really great close range option out of all the lights that we're going to talk about today. That's something that I identified as being really great about the Inforce lights. Now, I had a really bad interaction with their customer service. I'm not buying these lights anymore, but that doesn't mean that I wouldn't necessarily recommend them as much as be careful if you have to talk to their customer service. That's just something that stands out to me. I think this would be for a little bit more money than a Firefield. I think this is a far better light, personally. All right, now from there, let's go ahead and talk about the WMLx. Here it is. Mounted on my go-to rifle. Now, this is a 700 lumen light. Now, they also have an 800 lumen variant. This one happens to have IR capability. We're not necessarily going to talk about IR capability in these lights today. It's far too niche of a market. If that's something that really interests you guys, we can talk about it another time, but it takes a lot more effort for me to be able to cover IR type lights. Now, this same type of deal, right? Same construction, all that kind of stuff. This comes in at roughly about 160 bucks. This has a wider beam. The candela on it is still not as powerful as even like the Protac or anything along those lines, the HLX, excuse me. But we have even more lux and a positive relationship with lux than we had with the WML, and it's 400 lumens. So our 700 lumens output is getting us a little bit better for that close range type setup. This is a pretty excellent light, right up there with the WML, and a little bit greater output, and still under $200. There's a lot to be said for this particular setup. All right, from there, let's go ahead and talk about the TLR-2. Now, the TLR-2 on this Savage Model 120 Winchester 1200, 1300 amalgamation that I have going on here, this is an actual pistol light that I have mounted onto a shotgun, which some guys like running pistol lights on their long gun setups. That is an option. I'm not necessarily taking that away from anybody. Now, this has a 1000 lumen output and also a red visible laser. All right, coming in at roughly 225-ish. These are not a bad contender on the market. Now, one of the issues is that we have a fairly wide beam in the aspect of our lux and all that kind of stuff, and it definitely would perform very well on a pistol type setup. On a rifle type setup, this has a couple of disadvantages that I don't necessarily like, and also kind of bleeds over into the pistol aspect, and that is that we have a lot of candela at the center, which means that we're washing out potentially a lot of fine detail at the very center of the beam, which we have a tendency to focus the center of the light on whatever it is that we're looking at. We might miss out on critical fine details with that being the case. Now, that also means, especially if you're using a strobe type function or something along those lines, this has a very great blinding effect, which could give us an advantage in the fight. That's another byproduct of candela that we kind of have to consider with that overall. Here, I can go right there. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the Protac HLX laser, which is mounted on this IWI Galil Ace. All right, we can see that is a honking setup. This is quite heavy, and it really shifts the balance point on this rifle, but that's a conversation for another time. This is a 1000 lumen output with a red visible laser. All right. And it comes in at roughly 150 bucks. Now, this has a much more focus beam, much higher candela output. But that is bringing in the same issue that we were talking about the TLR-2HL, which is that we get a lot of wash in the very center. So our lux doesn't look too bad, all that type of stuff, but it is a little overpowered in the short range type sense. So if you're looking to use this inside of a home, you might lose some critical details, be it, you know, room clearing, whatever it is that you're doing at the time. You might miss out on something that is quite important because it is so focused. All right, let's go ahead. We'll talk about the first one, or the only one that I have out here that is discontinued, and that is the Surefire M620 mounted on a ZPAP M70. Now, this also has an IR setting and a 500 lumen output light. Now, this has a very focused beam on it, which is kind of surprising, based on its output and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have a whole lot of lux. Your only really good visual input comes from the center of the actual beam itself. Now, some of that might be because I have also a lot of wash coming off the front sight, but we kind of got to work with what it is that we have set up, and on this rifle currently, that's something I'm going to have to contend with. And that's also something that we'll discuss a little bit more thoroughly here after a bit. All right, now let's go ahead and talk about the Surefire M600 mounted on this LWRC M6 IC-A5. Now, this is a dual fuel setup that you can both run a charger or also the CR123s. I don't know why that was difficult for me to remember there for a second. Anyway, this has, let me double check this. Yep, 1000 lumen output. However, I was really surprised at the poor candela and not a lot of lux. Now, we're still getting a fairly wide beam overall, but for its output and cost at coming in about $300, I really expected better detail to be distinguished. Now, I'm starting to wonder if perhaps something's up with my setup, because the Surefires have a much better reputation than that, and I run an M300 at work, which has, I've never had any issue with being able to identify very fine details in the dark with that particular setup. I seldom have any issues with shadowing and all that kind of stuff. So perhaps that's something I have to look into a little bit closer with this, but with the data that we have, with the available data that we have to be able to represent what it is that's going on with this setup, I was actually very underwhelmed with its overall output, especially compared to a lot of the Streamlight offerings, which are much cheaper. Might be something I have to look into more thoroughly in the future. All right, now the last one, which is our most expensive one, is a Cloud Defensive Owl, which comes in at roughly $400, and I have it tossed on top of my Mark 12 inspired build. This build does not normally have a light on it, and this light is a reminder as to why I haven't put a light on this gun, because this really changed the balance point on this rifle and really added a fair amount of weight. This is actually a light that I'm borrowing from a friend. This has 1250 lumen output, and it is very bright. Also, it has a very intensive candela output. Now, you can really see that in the beam. It has a very tight, very focused beam, but it still has a lot of lux, and it has great coverage around that beam. I really appreciate this light. This is definitely, the weight notwithstanding, this is definitely worth the price, in my own opinion. For its outputs, for what it is that you're getting out of the light, you're not losing a lot of fine detail within the actual beam itself, and you have a wide enough, it's a little narrower of a beam at distance than, say, some of the Streamlight offerings. However, it still has a lot of coverage, especially when you consider how intense that focus of the beam is. I would have expected that it would have been much tighter overall. Like, initially when I was setting up this comparison, I expected that this light was going to have just this absolute laser pointer of a beam overall, and that it wasn't going to be all that great on the lux. And it actually really surprised me with how much lux we had and how tight that beam managed to maintain itself, so that you didn't wind up losing a lot of the fine detail in the center. I really appreciate that outcome. This is causing me to have to reevaluate these lights a little bit more. All right, guys, now let's go ahead and talk about light setup, because that's pretty much what I have for comparison. One of my major things with lights is that I have them in a location that I can access them from with either hand. Should I be doing some, cross shoulder type stuff and need to be able to activate my light with my support hand, or however it is that it needs to be. If I need to activate the light with what is normally my firing hand, but I have my support hand on the pistol grip. So that is why I have run like this Inforce WMLx on top of the rail with my iron sight placed behind it. These are backup sights. I'm not worried about being able to pick up fine details with them, and it is more important to me to be able to access that light. This is what I expect to use far more often than my backup sights. Now, sometimes, based on whatever weapon system it is that you've selected for yourself, it can be a little bit difficult to access those things. So like on this IWI X95 Tavor, this is a very tall rail. I used to have this mounted on the top rail, and it wound up being exceedingly fat to try to get my hand wrapped all the way around it to be able to activate the light, and I lost the use of my front sight. So I wound up moving it over to here. Now, having this vertical grip has also made it to where I can still, and kind of, it's a little bit of a wonky grip, it's not terribly comfortable, I can still access this light. So I haven't completely lost interchangeability with it between my hands. However, at a certain point, you might run into a condition where you're going to have to do some updates. Now, on this Galil Ace, I wound up having to do a little bit of a Picatinny inception. So I have a Picatinny rail with a 45-degree offset Picatinny setup so that I can then run my Protac Picatinny rail mount off of it. Not exactly my favorite setup. There's a lot of failure points that are incorporated in here. I have two different screws that I have to be able to keep these things together, and that's an issue to me. That's something that I'm not liking about this long term. And one of the issues here, well, I can reach the light, but I still have to kind of wonky reach over, and it's not necessarily something I'm loving about it. Now that is something that I changed up on this Ruger M70 ZPAP, which originally had a Picatinny setup on this M620. It did not. It would have been centrally located on this rail, and I didn't want that to happen. So I wound up going through impact weapons components in order to be able to get this offset light setup here. So now I can activate this in the normal manner and then also roll up on top of the rail. I don't obscure my sights or anything like that, and I can still get access to the light. That is what I would recommend, getting a dedicated offset mount instead of stacking a whole bunch of different mounts. Now, historically, guys, I do not like pressure pads, and what I specifically don't like about pressure pads is that an accidental discharge of light at the wrong time is just as bad as an ende. It should be treated in the same manner if you just discharge your firearm when you did not intend to. It can be just as, and be it on the visible or IR spectrums, it doesn't matter. Discharging a light when nobody's ready for you to be discharging a light is unacceptable in a lot of different circumstances, be it home defense or professional type settings. You don't want to do that. One of my issues with pressure pads is that they're not necessarily protected or anything along those lines, so it's very easy to accidentally actuate that light. Now, in a couple of instances, I have utilized pressure pads. On older rifle setups, before I started to be more aware of this type of thing, I was utilizing pressure pads in order to be able to have that easy offset type setup. I started moving away from it, but if you haven't done an offset mount or something like that, it can become a little bit difficult. So on some setups, up until I actually go ahead and buy a dedicated setup, a dedicated offset setup, I am running pressure pads like on this LWRC. I used to have the clicky cap setup, but trying to access it with my dominant hand whenever I'm transitioning shoulders was difficult. It was non-sustainable. On my work rifle right now, I'm having to move my M300 over to the other side because of my current sling setup. So it's now riding on this side of the rail, and I'm going to have to run a pressure pad up until I either get a dedicated offset mount or I move my sling setup, not my sling point, to a different position. One of those things has to give. I just haven't decided which one yet. So that's something to keep in mind with those setups. Now, I do want to go ahead and talk about lasers real quick. A lot of people like to espouse the value of lasers. I don't consider them to have a value, especially when you're talking about using a light laser combination. You'll note that quite a few of the pictures of our light laser combo setups, you could not make out the red laser. That's potentially problematic if you're depending on that for your engagement. I would not depend on lasers unless we're utilizing them in the IR spectrum because we have MBGs on. That's a time to depend on lasers. Just for day-to-day type stuff, visible spectrum lasers, they are something that is potentially helpful, that in a professional sense you could utilize as a way to de-escalate a situation. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend using them for de-escalation in a defensive type setting. You get into a really weird middle ground whenever you start to behave in that manner, kind of like using rubber bullets or something like that as a way to diffuse the situation. You could actually get yourself into quite a spot of trouble with that. You need to be on top of local laws, possibly speak to a lawyer on the subject so that they can best advise you as to how to go about that. Myself personally, I've seen people get really wrapped into lasers and then really fumble when they don't have access to them anymore, when they thought they would be in a scenario where they had access to them and they weren't working out the way they wanted them to. So I have light laser combos because I got the light for a pretty decent price. I wasn't pursuing the laser aspect of it. It was just kind of an extra in everything but, where'd it go? The Ruger Mini14, because as you can see here with the scope setup, I can't really mount iron sights and I needed a backup sighting system, so it wound up being the laser. But this is also no longer a viable or go-to defensive option for me. So that is due in part to the light, but then also I've got a lot of other much better setups. This was an evolutionary step for me, but you can cover more of that in its actual dedicated review. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting and helpful, and have a good day.